Hello and welcome to the All About Pigeons podcast. Today we're going to be talking English trumpeters with Bob Nolan. Bob Nolan is a National Pigeon Association master breeder of the English trumpeter. He's judged the breed internationally and judged the second largest trumpeter show with over 1,000 birds there. Well, Bob, thanks for coming on and talking with us today.
My pleasure.
So let's get into the origin and history of the English trumpeter first off.
Well, first off, the trumpeter goes back about almost 400 years, but in the early days, they were not designated English trumpeters, Dresden trumpeters, Bokhara, Russian, Altenburg. They were just called trumpeters. The generic term trumpeter is used as far back as 1552. You can believe that, over 400 years ago. They had illustrations of birds that were similar to birds of today, with the exception that they had no tuft. They had the muffs, they had the crest, they had the rosettes, but the beak tuft, or beak crest as the Germans call it, was missing. The first trumpeter that actually showed a tuft appeared in a painting by Johann Frisch in 1733. So it's safe to say that by 1700 to 1735, a mutation had occurred and the tuft became a part of the breed. It's important to note that these early illustrations of the so-called trumpeter were of the English type and not the Russian or Bokhara with the huge rose. It appears that the trumpeter actually developed independently in several parts of the world by 1735. Now in England, from 1700 to 1860, the so-called English trumpeter comes into existence, and that term is mentioned for the first time. Until about 1860, the so-called English trumpeter is the trumpeter of choice in England. But then in 1860, there's an importation from Germany of the new style trumpeter, which was called in those days a Russian trumpeter, today called the Bokhara trumpeter. Now they competed in the same competition, so you can imagine a Bokhara against an English. The Bokhara won easily, and it wasn't long before the breeders of the old style English trumpeter shifted over to the new Bokhara Russian style of trumpeter. Now, if you stop and think a little bit about your American history, in the time period from 1840 maybe to 1900, we have this mass migration of people from England, Ireland, Scotland that come to America. And most of them were poor people, and they knew that they would probably not ever see their homeland again. So what they did is they not only packed up their personal possessions that they treasured, but they also boxed up these pigeons, these trumpeters that they had, because they knew there weren't any in America where they were going. So these English trumpeters were packaged below deck for that crossing across the Atlantic, and they took root here in America in the 1840s on. And they were the trumpeter of choice here because the Bokharas didn't come until quite a bit later, probably around 1900 or 1910 that Bokhara becomes popular in the United States. The English have a small following in those days, you could probably classify them as a rare breed. There were no specialty club for the trumpeters in those days. There was no standard written. They were in the rare breed classification. Probably up until about 1930 and the start of the Depression, there were a number of English trumpeters that were still being shown. When I wrote the NPA history book, I came across mentions of English trumpeters during the Roaring *20s. But by the 1930s and the Depression, the breed almost dies out completely. The gentleman who is credited with bringing the breed back to prominence is a man named Paul J. Stephenson. He was a mailman who lived in the outskirts of Chicago in a small suburb called Berwyn, Illinois. He decided that he wanted to devote his pigeon activities to a rare breed that was on the verge of extinction. So he began to search for the, quote, so-called English trumpeters. His search was through the American Pigeon Journal. Anybody that advertised English trumpeters for sale, Stephenson would write them and pretty much bought them sight unseen. He told me in personal letters that when these birds arrived, he couldn't believe the differences. So many of them were crosses with Russian trumpeters, Dresden trumpeters, and even swallows. Being that there was no standard, people were just going off in any direction that they wanted. And it made for quite a bit of dissension at the shows because there was no written standard, and the judges, they didn't particularly like judging a breed where there was no guideline. After World War II, actually around 1947, the interest in the breed had increased due to Stephenson's efforts. He had developed a following of fanciers in Iowa, Wisconsin, Illinois, and a few other Midwestern states. So they decided that this breed, if it was going to survive, was going to have a standard written, and they were going to have a club. So they sent out notices to all the known breeders that they would meet at Watertown, Wisconsin in January of about 1947, I believe it was. And they wanted everybody to bring what they considered to be their best trumpeters to that show. And what a show it was. They had 347 birds in that show, and that record stood for 20 years until it was broken in 1967 at our pageant of pigeon. The way they wrote the standard I thought was most unique. They decided that they needed some referees. Instead of the fanciers deciding what was going to be, they called on all breed judges. And the best judges of the day were J.J. Kiefer, Charles Bartling. And what they did is they asked the fanciers to go out into the showroom and bring back the best bird they had for muff. And they put them in the cages, and the judges looked them over, and they decided what the best muffs would be. They took the birds back. They said, go get your best crested bird and bring the best crested birds in. The judges looked at all the different crests and things, and they decided, they wrote up the wording of what it's going to be. They also went from top to bottom, and it took over 7 hours to write that standard. But the amazing thing about that is that that standard has stood the test of time with just a few modifications. I believe that the reason for that is that they got the best minds available to write that standard, the outstanding all-breed judges of that day. At that same show, they established the English Trumpeter Club of America. and they began to promote the breed now with a standard that everybody had, quote, agreed upon. Period of improvement and growth between 1947 and 1957. They bred out a lot of the faults and things that came from the crossbreeding. Just remember, all of these so-called English trumpeters were a bunch of crosses from all different types of trumpeters and swallows. They finally narrowed that down to where they could make it really a purebred English trumpeter. So by 57, the breed has reached some degree of prosperity, especially in the Midwest. At that time period, Paul Stephenson had difficulties with a neighbor, and his days as the major promoter of the breed were limited. And he decided that he was going to send his best birds to a bunch of juniors, if you can believe it or not, in California. Happened to be myself, Arnold Berkowitz, Ralph Rodheim. All of these juniors got the birds that Stephenson had perfected, so to speak. And he caught a lot of slack from the guys in the Midwest and said, "Why are you sending those birds to these kids?" We were about 13, 14, 15 years old. He told me in letters, we were pen pals, that he had the feeling that we would be the future of the breed. I'm kind of proud to say that came to pass. The group of junior breeders grew up and took the breed to another level of development in the 60s, 70s, and on to the present. That's probably the best history that I can give you in a nutshell of the breeds, going over about a 400-year period. Going upwards to the present, I think it would be a little bit too wordy at this time. So,
have you always kept this breed as a fancier?
Well, let me share that with you. It's kind of a story where there's a fork in the road, and I went one way instead of another, and the history of the breed was changed. I grew up in Burbank, in California, and there was a famous Russian trumpeter breeder named Chuck Haynes, who was there, and he was also the president of the Los Angeles Pigeon Club. He lived about a mile from my home. I found out about him, and I went down there when my dad took me down there, and he had these beautiful Russian trumpeters. And I was just, overjoyed to see these birds. But the problem was that the price on the birds was $25 a piece, which in 1955, 56, 57 was a lot of money for a 13-year-old. My dad was not a wealthy man. Haynes told me about a fella in La Crescenta named Harvey Gatlin. And Harvey Gatlin had English trumpeters that he sold for $5 a piece. So it wasn't long before my dad took me up to Mr. Gatlin's place. He set me up with several very nice birds for a price that we could afford. And about that time, I had several boyhood friends in the neighborhood that were raising pigeons. And when they saw what I got for $5 a bird, they went up there and got their birds as well. So that's how we got started. Now, if those Bokhara trumpeters had been $5 a piece, maybe Bob Nolan would have been raising Bokhara trumpeters to this day and not English. But there was a fork in the road, and that was the one that I took.
That makes sense. That's Phil's thing.
That's right.
It's $10 or less. It's a show bird.
Yep. Price plays a big role sometimes.
Well, the interesting thing about it was that Harvey Gatlin had tried for years to get adult fanciers interested in English trumpeters, but their development, this was before the Stephenson birds came out here, was so poor that he couldn't get any adult fanciers to raise them. So he decided that he would, quote, raise his own fanciers, and he devoted his time to us juniors. He didn't have any kids of his own, but he loved kids, and he took many of us around to shows, and he was the catalyst to start the Western American Trumpeter Club. That was basically a junior club with 2 adult members, and we got a lot of the traditions that we're following today, such as the judge teaches as he judges, started in 1957 when that club was organized.
So what is the temperament like on this breed of bird? Are they aggressive or pretty docile, easy to handle?
Yeah, the English trumpeter is like somewhere in the middle, and when it comes to its docileness and tameness, aggressiveness, it's not as people-friendly as a pouter, but it's a lot more tame than a racing homer, a roller, or many of the other breeds. The English trumpeter is quite a relaxed bird when it's in the judging pen. It isn't a bird that paces. It will pretty much station itself, and for that reason, the judge has an easier time of evaluating it than some breed like Chinese owl that's pacing all the time back and forth. So the temperament on the English is somewhere between a pouter and a homer. I think for the most part, the people that raise them find them to be relatively easy to tame down, especially the little babies. If you start with the weaning pen, you'll have them pecking at your fingers in a few days.
Very cool. Now, this bird has very heavily feathered feet, right? So what kind of special care requirements do they have? I know the perches are kind of special, aren't they?
That's a good question. First off, the English trumpeter probably has about as big a muffs, if not bigger, than almost any other breed of pigeon. If you hold your hand up and look at your hand, that's about the size of the muffs on a good English trumpeter. In fact, of all the breeds of pigeons that have muffs, the English probably have got as big, if not the biggest, from top to bottom. The muffs are a hindrance during the breeding season, so they're cut back to about 1.5 to 2 inches during the breeding season. When you're preparing the birds for the show, you need to pull the feathers out, and it takes about 7 weeks in the warm climate for the muffs to come back in. One of the things that you need to do to keep the muffs in good condition is to have a perch that has an arm on it and a little circular station for the bird to stand on away from the wall, so they can turn around on that perch without brushing their muffs against the wall. Another thing that a lot of fellas do is during the show season, they'll bring in wood chips, shavings, etc., sawdust for the floor. And a set of muffs is usually good for about maybe 1 or 2 shows, and then they break off or they get dirty or what have you. It does take a little more care to get your birds in top show shape. And that's one of the things that some people dislike about muffed birds. They take a little more care, but they have a little more beauty attached to them as well.
Absolutely. The perches with the arms that stick out from the wall with the circular perches, do they have a special name for those, or is that just something that...
No, they're usually made of iron though, or metal, and then the actual platform that they stand on is usually wood.
Okay.
How big is that circle? Like, how big in diameter is that?
The circle's about 6 inches.
Oh, okay.
In diameter.
Are there any kind of health issues that's specific to this breed that you come across that you wouldn't see in other breeds?
Not like we run into in the Norwich croppers or Pomeranians or any of the birds that get sour crop. English are usually pretty healthy bird. things that we need to do are kind of common to all breeds of pigeons. You want to have good air circulation. You don't want them to be exposed to the rain because the muffs will get soiled and knock you out of the competition. So you need to have a loft that's rainproof. There's a couple different types of loft. I have one that has a drop-through floor that has pluses and minuses. Obviously, the pluses are that 80% of the droppings fall through and they're not walking around in their droppings. But the gratings are a little bit hard on the muff, so that would be the negative. Important though to have the perches away from the wall and not have anywhere that they can land where their muffs will push against the 2x4s or other construction pieces of lumber in your loft.
Makes good sense. I've seen a loft with those style of perches in them before. Now, this bird, is it a heavy-bodied bird?
They look quite heavy because we've shortened the breed up in the last 10 years. People often are surprised at the fact that they're probably more feather than meat. We want a good solid feel when you pick them up, but they're not like picking up a racing homer or a king or a house. Well, house pigeon is a little more like trumpeter in body weight.
Hard
I would say
feathered?
they have a medium body weight. They're certainly not like a Machinero or some of the other breeds of powders that are real thin, but they're not a heavyweight. They're in the middle.
Are they hard feathered?
They have what we call medium feather. That's an interesting question because in the early days, we did not have the big high crest that we have today. And all the birds in those days that were around were what we call hard feather. When John Hepner had a mutation and started to develop the bigger crest, the higher crest, we started to breed for a softer feathered bird. And we went through a period there where we were chasing the big crest at the expense of a hard feather. What we finally found out and where we're at today is that we need a medium feather. And that means the vein in the feather has got to be kind of thick, not real thin. You need to have some medium feathers so that you can get length, but you need to have a little bit of hardness so that it stands up. If you don't have the crest standing up at a 90-degree angle on the back of the head, you're going to get knocked down. Today's modern English trumpeter has medium hard feather.
Are they good breeders and good parents as far as raising up their own young, or do you foster?
I would probably put them in the middle. They're certainly not a racing homer or a roller that you can just throw in the cage and they'll breed 8 or 10 babies a year for you. But they're not an African owl or some of the other breeds that need to have foster parents. English can raise their own babies, but most of the guys find that in order to get the number of babies out a year that they want, that they foster out their young so that their numbers increase. The breed has so many feather features that can knock the bird out of competition that only about 1 out of 10 babies that you raise will be a show bird. So if you only raise 10 birds, you're in trouble.
Wow.
The most successful guys will raise 100 babies or sometimes even more. Yet we've also got breeders like John Fife, Greg Pola, several of them that come to mind that have been quite successful with a small loft. Numbers are important, but it's not the final deciding thing because it is possible if you select for just a few different colors, don't spread yourself out too thin to be successful with a relatively small, say maybe 10 to 15 pair of birds.
How many different colors are there in this breed?
Boy, that's one area that we're real proud of. We started out in 1957 with about 10 or 12 color classes. And as the years went by and more colors began to pop up and more guys became interested in rare colors, we now have 31 different color classes.
It's a lot of colors.
That's a lot.
Yeah, it is.
And we're working right now on things like barless, spangle, grizzle, opal. There's plenty of room for people that are interested in genetics to try English trumpeters, because we do have a big variety of colors and they're really quite attractive. You're almost sure to find one color that really strikes your fancy.
Very cool. You're breeding your colors together. Do they often pop up other colors, or are they bred pure?
Well, I'd say most of our guys are pretty knowledgeable on color breeding, and they make the matings that are successful. We've had some introductions of new colors from breeds that you would hardly believe, like the kings were used to develop the browns and the khakis. You can imagine a king made into a trumpeter. And the Clean Lake Tumblers brought in the Andalusian color into the breed. So there have been outcrosses to introduce new colors. Comorter Tumblers introduced grizzle into the breed. And I'm working on spangles, and I used German beak-crested trumpeters to try to bring in the spangle pattern into the breed.
Anybody ever use an ASR?
Not that I know of.
Okay.
It's interesting you should mention that, though, because our standard mentions the American show racer as the ideal body that we're striving for, that heart-shaped, hard feathered bird. So the body of an American show racer and an English trumpeter are hopefully very similar.
Very cool.
Is this a breed that's more for like the intermediate fancier or beginner, or someone who's looking to change it up and challenge themselves a little bit? Or
I believe that a new fancier can achieve some degree of success, but it's about a 5-year progress. That's what I tell new people coming in. If you're serious about what you're doing, it should be like about a 5-year learning process. We have a very competitive group of people. You know, our shows, especially in California, run anywhere from 300 to 500 birds, and there will be maybe 30 exhibitors. Like at the Pageant of Pigeons last year, we had about 375 birds and 30 exhibitors. So you can't come in and expect to jump right into the thick of competition right away. There's a learning curve. But I will say that the trumpeter breeders are, for the most part, very helpful and encouraging to new people. And they make birds available, you know, maybe like $50. $100 can still buy you quite a nice bird. They're in a medium price range that a new person in the breed can afford. I often tell people when they're getting started to start with some medium quality birds, raise them for a while, see if you like the breed, see if you like the people, and then if you do, go out and buy a little more expensive birds. But learn the fundamentals first. Don't go out and spend big bucks and, you know, lose a bird or two to death due to disease or something. Learn your fundamentals first and then move up. Look at it as a long-range project, not something that you have to have immediate success at. Because the guys that are in it have already been in it for 20, 30, 40 years. And you can't expect to jump ahead of those guys immediately. Your goal should be to be just competitive and to move your birds up in quality a little bit each year. Patience is important if you're going to raise English trumpeters.
Good advice there. So you mentioned Stevenson had started I don't know if it was a national club or maybe a local club There's still some national clubs that people can look into if they are interested in this breed.
Yeah, there's 3 national clubs. The oldest one is the English Trumpeter Club of America. That was the one that was founded in 1947. Their main culture center has always been the Midwest. Unfortunately, right now, that area is not populated by a whole lot of breeders. The ones that are there are good, but their numbers are small. The second club is the National English Trumpeter Club. I believe that club was started in about 1977 by a guy named Wes Shores, Eddie Lujan, and they have a following in New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, that area. They have done a good job at sponsoring shows in that part of the country. And then we have our Western American Trumpeter Club, which was founded in 1957. That club is probably the most active. We have about 7 or 8 shows a year. During the summer, we have a lawn show each month: June, July, August, September, October, November. All those months we've got a show. Then we finish up with the national. And we have now what we consider to be a combined show where the 3 clubs all come together to show at the national. And we were, I believe, the second biggest breed at the recent Louisville show. We had about 300 birds at that show. So by combining the 3 clubs together, we have some good competition at the national level.
Yeah, hearing the history about how that breed almost went extinct and to where we are today with being that many coming at the pageant and at the national show, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, if you take a look at some of the photographs of what the trumpeters looked like in the 40s, that you can see why they weren't very popular. They were long, they were tall, they were skinny. About the only thing they really had that was going for them was muffs. Muffs always seemed to be important, and one of the reasons was there was a lot of swallows crossed into the so-called trumpeters in those days. So muffs were one of the first things that were developed. The trumpeter of today is really a beautiful bird because it's got one of the shorter bodies, the higher crest, the station of the bird. It's just it's incredible to see the change that's taken place in 50 years in an English trumpeter. I have a page in the NPA history book where we start with a trumpeter of 1860 and we go right up to the present. There's about 20 different photographs, and you can see how the breed evolved and the years that it took to get to where we are today. There's a few areas where we still need to improve on. We have some breaks in the mane that need to be improved on. We need to continue to emphasize rosettes. Those are a couple areas that are difficult. I think the fact that the color still has some room for improvement as well. We made a lot of progress in color, but we're still not there yet. And part of it is because we have so many color classes that there aren't a lot of people working on barless or a lot of people working on creams. There's plenty of people racing blacks and whites and reds and yellows and all that. Those classes are way up high in quality. But the ones where there's just a few people working on them, there's certainly room for new fanciers to come in and make a name for themselves. It's one of the more complicated breeds. Oftentimes I'm called upon to judge for the overall champion of the show. And I try to point out to the other judges that I'm working with that there's degrees of difficulty in certain breeds of pigeons. Like I raise Norwich croppers. If I've got the right legs and I've got the right globe, I'm pretty much home. But in the English trumpeters, one bad tuft or oversized rosette or skinny body or big split in the muffs, and the bird's out. So there is a degree of difficulty with the trumpeter that's higher than most breeds that only need, one or two features. If you're raising Chinese owls, you need a lot of good features as well. So there is a certain degree of difficulty with a trumpeter because there's so many areas that you can fail in.
It's a good breed to raise for the competitive type of fancier.
If you like competition, it's really there. If you've got the desire to win first place, right away you need to raise Damascenes or Swabians or something with rare breeds. But if you don't mind taking your lumps, the English trumpeter is a great group of people. They have lots of activities. They have a lot of people that are willing to share their knowledge. And, the prices are reasonable. A very sociable group of people. They often have little baby shows with squeakers and what have you. And we just call that a social gathering to see how everybody's young birds are coming along. It's not we're worried about who wins first or second. It's a chance to socialize and find people that have that same common interest that we do.
Yeah, you guys are doing them every month too. That's really cool right there. That's a strong club.
Fun. We have our lawn shows often at people's homes, so you get a chance to see their loft set up and see how the brother fanciers handle their birds, what kind of breeding techniques and nests and what have you that they use. You're never too old to learn. There's always things that surprise me each day about the breed and about the actual hobby itself. A hobby, as we all know, where you can meet people from every social standing, every occupation. One thing you'll find in English trumpeters, we probably have more female fanciers in the breed than almost any other breed. It seems as though a lot of the ladies like the trumpeters.
Oh man, I got to get trumpeters now.
That's it.
Don't tell your wife if she listens to that.
That's very cool. Well, Bob, thanks for coming on and talking with us and educating everybody on this. This is a really interesting breed, and everybody out there listening, there is national clubs if you're interested in getting into this breed. They're strong.
I could add, if anyone would like further information, I'm going to give you my phone number. It's 949-542-9799, and I'd be glad to answer questions. I'm an old guy. I like the phone rather than texting.
You hear that, everybody? Text Bob Nolan immediately. Well, thanks for coming on and talking with us.